This is Prodeus, not Prodeus, Prodeus, very different games. And Prodeus is a retro-style shooter currently in early access, and although you've probably heard the whole retro-style shooter thing fairly frequently recently, which I'm kind of enjoying, this one is a little bit different in that regard because unlike a lot of its relatives, you know, like your Dusks or your Medievals, that sort of thing, this doesn't really feel like it's a deliberate callback to any one particular game of the 90s. Because if you look at some of the modern takes on this sort of genre, you see a lot of that, and there's nothing wrong with that, it's just this is not that, it seems like. Because if you look at something like Dusk, it is very clearly a sort of callback to Quake, with maybe a little bit of the First Blood in there as well, and you look at something like a Medieval, and it's very deliberately calling back to things like Heretic, a little bit of Hexen, that sort of thing. But in this case, it doesn't really, Prodeus doesn't feel like it's specifically trying to emulate any one particular game of the time, and it actually feels more like something like Ion Maiden, in that it is a modern interpretation that feels like if you just toned back some of the more advanced graphical things, it could have actually come out during that time, during the 90s, as its own thing. It's not calling back to anything, it is just sort of in that style, and that's actually a really cool thing. I tend to enjoy games like that a little bit more personally because it's neat to see someone not just taking, you know, references or callbacks to any one thing and just sort of taking that theme, the sort of 90s classic shooter, and making their own entire experience out of it instead. And that's exactly what Prodeus feels like to me. And the first thing to talk about, obviously, is its appearance. It uses a sort of combination between 2D sprite-based stuff and 3D models, akin to some things like Quake, but in its own style. It is kind of unique looking because it is somewhat pixely, but not what I would call pixel art. It has a lot of 3D modeling, but it's still kind of chunky looking, and that lends it this very specific art style that's quite glowy as well. There's a lot of glow and not necessarily bloom, but just pretty much everything glows, and a lot of explosion effects and things are quite bright and pretty. There's a lot of color contrast with your blues and oranges, and a lot of the environments have a good amount of like gray and brown in them to give a good sort of industrial or earthy toned backdrop to all of the bright, colorful explosions and gun effects and things that are a much more colorful gamut compared to the grays and browns. So it's actually quite a colorful game, but it doesn't use the... it's more like the Doom 2 version of colorful, where you have to take the sort of environment art and the actual effects, weapons, monsters, and things in combination to get the full like color scale, because each one is only really a half of the actual color variety that you're seeing, unlike something like Quake, which is very like, you know, brown and green and kind of dirty and grungy looking on purpose, and everything follows that color scaling sort of principle, where it's kind of a simple art style that is definitely quite dirty and nasty looking purposefully, so industrial, you could say. And in this case, you combine these sort of industrial or spaceport looking environments and the hellish, more like acid canyon landscapes and things with all of the colorful enemy types and weapon effects and things, and it creates a pretty nice looking art style that I really enjoy, actually. And it helps that the weapon animations and things are quite nice. And even though the enemies and weapons are in a sort of sprite-based style, they also still have an interesting sort of hybrid look where they look like sprites created from 3D models rather than simple 2D sprites. So there is an interesting sort of hybrid effect to the overall art style where everything that moves, everything that's dynamic in the environment is sort of like 2.5D almost, you could say. And it definitely helps to create this overall atmosphere of like chunky future sci-fi industrialness with a little bit of hellishness in there as well. And it's actually a pretty neat art style. The weapons are definitely the next choice to talk about because any good retro shooter sort of lives or dies on its arsenal, and the weapons in this game are extremely satisfying and actually quite varied. There's about 3 weapons for each type, so you have, you know, your bullet-using weapons, your shell-using weapons, energy weapons, and some other stuff like that. So each sort of category, each ammo type has about 3 currently different weapons in it, and although I don't think every single one is available in the early access currently, there are still quite a lot of weapons. There's a lot of variety in the arsenal, and a lot of them are just really fun. The weapons are extremely satisfying to use because they have a very chunky, nice sound to them. They have very high-quality sound effects, and I think that's one of the underappreciated aspects of a first-person shooter, the sound and the, you know, just the audio feedback of your weapons. That adds a lot to how nice and satisfying they feel, and in this case they definitely nailed that because the weapons sound great. The shotgun is a riot to use because it just takes things to pieces in a big way, and its alt fire is like a sort of flaming explosive shell thing. And yes, every weapon does have a primary and secondary fire, so that's also good and something that pretty much any old school shooter should have, in my opinion. And the overall current arsenal ranges from simple things like a pistol, whose alt fire causes it to aim down sights and turn into a 3-shot burst pistol, to the shotgun, as I already mentioned, to a minigun and dual assault rifles that very satisfyingly sort of take things apart in front of you because of their high fire rate, although kind of a high spread as well, as you would expect from dual-wielding assault rifles. And things like grenade launchers that have a sticky and normal grenade launching mode. If you hold the alt fire, it will fire a sticky grenade. Rocket launcher that you can detonate the rockets in midair for like airburst potential and has a very deceptively large blast radius, to your more exotic things like the chaos weapons, which are some of my favorite because they're just kind of nuts. There's basically like a railgun. It's called the arc rail. That is the first chaos weapon that you get, which fires a sort of branching red lightning bolt that can branch between multiple enemies, chain lightning style, and it's quite rapid fire and doesn't have to be reloaded all that often, but its alt fire flips up a scope and charges a much more powerful, basically rail shot that can pierce through any enemies in front of you, and uses 10 of the ammo per shot, so you have to be careful about using it too much. And there are also some energy weapons, and the first energy weapon you get is a very clear sort of, I guess you could say, like mechanical callback to the plasma rifle of Doom. It rapid fires blue orbs of death at quite a high rate, and its alt fire actually marks an enemy for tracking, and you can then curve the shots around corners and things and just do indirect fire, which is really cool. You know, you mark a very troublesome enemy that you don't want to be in direct line of sight of and then hide behind some cover for a second while you fire curved shots around it that will seek out the enemy. It's actually really neat, and that's definitely the case for all of the weapons in this game that I found so far. They all have a nice niche to fill. There aren't too many of them to where they feel superfluous, but there are enough of them to give you a lot of variety, and with the nice lighting and sound effects, they all feel very satisfying to use, and a lot of the alt fires are quite creative. Another important thing to take note of that you're no doubt noticing right now in the background footage is that there is a very nice gore system, and enemies go it to pieces in a very satisfying way. This helps with the combat and the overall weapon handling to feel, you know, even better, because if you have a shotgun and you basically separate the top half from the bottom half of an enemy with one blast of it, it feels really good to use, and that's exactly what happens in this game. The enemies, despite being sort of sprite-based looking, as I mentioned, are actually basically models, so that means they can be taken apart in all sorts of detailed ways. They can lose limbs, they can be blasted into pieces, and some of them can even live and continue to go after you, missing arms and stuff like that. So yeah, the weapons do actually take enemies to pieces in a super satisfying way, and just watching in the background, as you can see right now, enemies just coming to pieces in the combat makes the combat feel really, really good. And the final really big important aspect of shooters like this is the map design. How are the actual levels? The game actually uses a sort of adventure-y level-based sort of a system where you actually go to a overall sort of map screen that allows you to travel in between different levels. This means you can retry old levels whenever you want, which is super nice because there are a lot of secrets in this game, and I'm not very good at finding them. I usually only find like half or so of the secrets in any given level because they're everywhere, and some of them are pretty tricky to get to. And so yeah, you can actually replay any of the old levels you want at any time just by traveling along this sort of node-based map, like campaign map screen. Beating one mission will of course activate any nodes attached to that mission and allow you to travel to them. So that means there are some branching paths. You don't necessarily have to do all of the levels in the exact same order, which is super cool. And there are also some sort of side levels and challenge missions and things, like special challenges for each weapon type, teleporters that lead you to other side missions on the world map screen, all that sort of stuff. So it's a pretty neat kind of not common thing for old school shooters. You don't usually see a sort of map selection like that. Generally it's like just one map to the next, you know, episode 1, map 1, and then you just move on like that. But in this case, no, there actually is a level select screen, which I actually like because of both the aforementioned ability to take on previous levels and do it better this time with new equipment and stuff, and the fact that it shows you there are some branching paths and side missions and stuff to do, which is always good for variety in games like this. As for the levels themselves, they are structured in a pretty classic shooter way, but they are quite large. A lot of them can take upwards of, 15 minutes to actually complete the first time if you're trying to just sort of take your time and look for everything instead of going for like the fastest time you can. Obviously, if you're like speed running, you can complete them pretty quickly, but they are quite sprawling. Even the opening levels can get pretty large with multiple paths. Some areas you may come back to for keys. Some areas, if you don't explore thoroughly before moving on, you may actually lose access to and need to restart the mission to go back to. So yeah, the the levels, the maps really are just, they're big and they're actually pretty complex with a lot of stuff that old school shooters couldn't do. You know, a lot of fairly complex geometry and lifts and modal switches and platforms you shoot to activate and drainable acid ditches and all sorts of stuff. They're actually really well designed levels, and a lot of love has obviously been put into them. And I actually can't think of any one specific old school shooter that the level structures make me think of the most. I think it's actually very much its own thing, honestly, and that's another one of the aspects that I was talking about when it comes to this game could have, with less intense graphical effects, come out during the 90s and been its own game and is not really a callback to anyone in particular that already existed. And yeah, the level design makes that pretty clear. It's got a lot of sci-fi elements and a couple of more arcane-y demonic elements, as you would expect from a shooter like this, and that makes quite a bit of variety in the actual map designs that you'll go through, from like sci-fi facilities to your aforementioned acid canyons to some more strange floaty hellish landscapes and stuff. There's quite a bit of map variety already. And the last thing I think to really note about an old school shooter is its enemy variety, and even though this is in early access, there are already quite a few different enemy types, including some with different variants depending on other enemies that can spawn in, more elite or mini boss like enemies that can actually alter already spawned in enemies to be more difficult and give them new attacks and stuff. So that's cool. So yeah, the enemy variety right now is a little bit reminiscent of like Doom 2, but still doesn't really feel like it's deliberately calling back to that exclusively. It's got some Doom 2-ish things. You know, your fireball throwing imps, your chain gun guys, that sort of thing, but even those are not really explicit, like we took this from Doom 2 because we liked it and didn't change it at all. They are a little bit different, and the enemy AI is actually quite nice as well. They will flank you, they will deploy extra units at inopportune moments for you in different areas to make sure you can't just stand still. This is very much a game of moving around, as it should be, and in fact you do actually get a dash later on too that allows you to move around even more. And of course, naturally, you do have your secret hunting and your keys to find to open color-coded doors, and even some other stuff that adds to the keys' usages. There will sometimes be chests around the place that can contain weapons and ammo and stuff that are locked behind keys, and they don't need to be opened to complete the level, but if you remember where they were and then go and get that key now that you actually have it, you can go back and either unlock a secret by using it or just help yourself to a nice boost in ammo and armor. So that's really a good overview, I think, of Prodeus. Overall, I think it is a very solidly designed game. It does use a checkpoint system. Also, I should mention, there is not a quick save or anything like that. You'll just run into those blue orbs that will save a checkpoint in the mission. Of course, you do get better score for going through a mission without dying and using one, but you know, that's if you care about score. But yeah, so this is definitely a game that's been made with a lot of love so far, and even though it's in early access, there's enough here for me to say that I definitely would recommend people that are looking for a good old school style shooter to take a look at it. There's a lot of levels, a lot of enemy variety, a lot of weapon variety already. It doesn't feel like you're just barely getting any content because it's too early or anything. It's actually got quite a bit to offer already, and I would love to see what they're going to be doing next, what some of the later weapons that are going to be added are to round out the arsenal, and of course what the later sort of episodic levels are going to be like, because they just keep getting more and more complex and evil with their designs. So yeah, this is definitely a game that has a lot of love poured into it. Also, I should mention, the soundtrack is great and is made by Andrew Hulshult, who I've mentioned on this channel before. Fantastic artist when it comes to this sort of industrial and metal-y soundscape. He's really good at that sort of thing, and this is no different. It's got a fantastic soundtrack that is worth listening to on its own, honestly. So yeah, that is Prodeus. I will link in the description below this video to the Steam store page if you want to get in on the early access, or just wishlist it and watch for some more updates. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.